The most interesting thing in impact. It is the week of the United Nations General Assembly, and delegates from 193 countries are in New York. There are literally about 150 events discussing everything from child rights to the global obesity crisis. There are two summits that I'll be following closely and I think have significant impacts. The first is the SDG Summit, which takes place this week. The second is the Summit of the Future, which builds on the SDG Summit and actually takes place in September 2024. I'll get into this in a minute. The SDG Summit is a centerpiece for 2023. It's convened by the President of the UN General Assembly, so it's a pretty big deal. And it marks the halfway point between the 2015 launch of the SDGs and the 2030 deadline. It's like the world giving itself a mid-year review on the planet and humanity's well-being. For many, though, it won't be energizing. Listen, there have been huge leaps made since 2015, and there are examples from around the world, from improvements in basic sanitation to protection of coastal areas to huge leaps in digital accessibility, partly thanks to the pandemic. And John MacArthur, the head of the Brookings Center for Sustainable Development, said it himself not long ago. The bottom line is that the world has not been doing enough things differently enough to be on course for the SDG success. And that's just disappointing. Although the framework itself has been criticized for its rigidity and lack of evolution in a post-global pandemic world, it remains, though, an instrumental framework for global human progress. Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau will be in New York for a range of events. Ironically, though, even though Canada announced a national SDG strategy in 2021 and Prime Minister Justin Trudeau is the co-chair for the Global SDG Advocates Group, which works to raise awareness of the goals and the need for accelerated action, a recent Brookings report on the status of the SDGs mentions the SDGs remain underleveraged, underpowered, and underrepresented in Canada. The goals are often mentioned in policy announcements, but not actually embedded in plans. And I agree. Canada is actually moving backwards in relation to the world on our overall SDG progress, ranking 29th in 2022, down from 21st in the previous year. So, is Canada actually serious about the SDGs? Frankly, I don't get that sense. Even though we're battling affordability, wildfires, hurricanes, and mental health at scale, also, how is the social impact world accountable to the SDGs? It's our most important to-do list for our communities. Well, there really isn't anything at the moment. Can we really expect action without accountability? I think it's a dream. Now, let's move on to the Summit of the Future. This is even more ambitious, but there are really few exciting areas of hope for me. First, there is a push to create frameworks that help organizations account for the intergenerational impacts of the work they do. Right now, social purpose organizations have made no public commitment to future generations or to be accountable for the intergenerational consequences of their programs and services. Second area of focus that is worth watching is the push to measure human progress more effectively. The GDP is on its last legs. There has been a need for metrics beyond GDP and jobs that actually take into account vulnerability, well-being, planetary sustainability, and more. The UN is prioritizing this and supporting experiments on this front. And I believe this will give the post-GDP discourse renewed momentum. And lastly, and perhaps the most critical of all, is the UN 2.0 agenda. It's not sufficient to address problems outside the UN when the UN itself isn't fit for purpose. UN 2.0 is all about reimagining, reforming, and modernizing internal institutional structures, mindsets, governance models, accountabilities, processes, and so on. It's all that internal boring stuff that most social purpose organizations barely touch. It's one thing to add more Black, Indigenous, and people of color to boards, but it's a whole other thing to question, examine, and reimagine fundamentals like Robert's rules. And when we question the fundamentals, we're aiming for systemic change. That's the most interesting thing in impact. See you next week.